And Barry is back there with books, right? We've got a new book this morning. So if you didn't get a book last week, you'll need one this morning. Just raise your hand. He'll get you one. Thank you, Barry. And Mike. One or two more back through there, man. Brother Jackie, would you mind leading us in a word of prayer as we get started, sir? Thank you, Jackie. So we are talking about Daniel this quarter, and studying the book of Daniel and kind of looking at what scholars had to say, I found something sort of interesting that a lot of people dispute the fact that Daniel wrote, well, I say a lot of people, some people dispute the fact that Daniel wrote the book in the time period that is likely when he did write it, while these things were happening, and their reason for not believing that he wrote it in the time period that these events transpire is because they say his prophecies are so specific and so detailed, and they came true exactly the way he wrote it, that it has to have been an historical account rather than prophecy. So they say it had to be that he wrote it, or that it was written by somebody besides Daniel years later, because it's so specific and detailed about how these things transpired. And, of course, we know that that's how you know prophecy is true. If you judge a prophet by whether or not the things that he prophesies come true. So I think that's kind of far-fetched to think that he didn't write the book. It's pretty obvious he refers to himself and kind of transitions in different parts of the book, or talking about himself and the first person and third person. But most Bible scholars do agree that he did write the book, and that it was written around 550 BC to 600 BC, somewhere in that time period. But I want to go back to 1 Kings and kind of try to set the stage for the book before we get into the specifics of our lesson. In 1 Kings 24, if you want to turn there with me, that's where we're actually going to start this morning, because I think it's important that we know kind of what's going on in history. And sometimes these Old Testament books are hard to grasp the details because of where they're located in the Bible. We all know that the Old Testament wasn't written in chronological order. That books just... I believe I did say that, yes. 1 Kings 24 is where we're actually going to start, Don. But just because a book came later in the Old Testament like Daniel did, it's the events of that time are spoken of in 2 Kings 24. So, yes, I probably did say 1 Kings 24, which I'm assuming does not exist since you're looking at me like that. So, 2 Kings 24. Thank you, Don. 2 Kings 24. But King Josiah has died. Josiah, the king of Judah. And what do we remember about King Josiah? Do you remember anything about King Josiah? Was he good or bad? He was good. We call him Good King Josiah. He became king when he was 8 years old, and that's what I always remembered about him. When I hear lessons about Josiah as a kid, he was 8 years old, and I thought that was pretty cool when I was a kid, that there would be a king who was 8 years old. But he reigned over 30 years and was one of the few good kings that Judah had. This is in the time period that the nation has been divided in two. You have Israel to the north, Judah to the south. And Josiah was the king of Judah. He dies. He's killed at the hands of the Egyptians. And his son becomes king, and his son reigns about 3 months. And the Egyptians get rid of him and bring in another king, and another son of Josiah by the name of Jehoiakim. And that's who it's talking about in verse 1 of 2 Kings 24. In his days, that is Jehoiakim, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his vassal for 3 years. Then he turned and rebelled against him, and the Lord sent against him raiding bands of Chaldeans, bands of Syrians, bands of Moabites, and bands of the people of Ammon. He sent against Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord which he had spoken by his servants the prophets. So Jehoiakim is a wicked king. He's the son of a good king, but he himself is a wicked king. And he is a vassal to Nebuchadnezzar, meaning Judah is still its own country, but not really. They're still under control by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. But he rebels against Babylon, and with the help of God, Nebuchadnezzar puts down that rebellion. Now, what's interesting about that is that God uses Nebuchadnezzar to put down a rebellion from Judah, his own people. Nebuchadnezzar was not a good person. He was a wicked king. And we see, and we're going to see throughout the book of Daniel, and just like we talked about when we studied Jeremiah, that God sometimes uses wicked people to fulfill his will, to do what he wants done. And Nebuchadnezzar is a perfect example of that. He was used to punish Israel. And this is something that had been spoken of by Moses. Let's look at the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 28. This is First Deuteronomy 28, Don. This is a chapter that W.A. and others have referred to before, and it's a very long chapter, 68 verses in this chapter. And the first 14 verses, God tells Israel through Moses about all the blessings that they are going to receive if they are obedient. If you listen to God, if you are obedient to Him, you're going to be safe from your enemies. You are going to have wealth. Good things are going to happen to you. The remainder of the chapter, the vast majority of the chapter, he explains the bad things that are going to happen to you if you don't obey God. All the curses, and they are bad. If you haven't read them recently, you might want to go through them. But all the things that are going to happen to you if you're not obedient to God. And specifically, look beginning in verse 64 of Deuteronomy 28. Then the Lord will scatter you among all peoples from one end of the earth to the other, and there you shall serve other gods, which neither you nor your fathers have known, wood and stone. And among those nations you shall find no rest, nor shall the sole of your foot have a resting place. But there the Lord will give you a trembling heart, failing eyes, and anguish of soul. Your life shall hang in doubt before you. You shall fear day and night and have no assurance of life. What's happening to them in Daniel's time, the fact that they are taken away from Jerusalem, taken away from Judah, and taken to Babylon, it's the fulfillment of what God said was going to happen, of what Moses warned them about. If you're not obedient, you're going to go serve other nations. You're going to be in a strange foreign place, and that's exactly what we're going to see as we study Daniel. I want to look at one more passage before we actually go to Daniel in 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Because the book of Daniel doesn't really cover this in the first chapter. It just kind of glances over, but I think it's important for us as a background, the actual fall of Jerusalem that was occurring in Daniel's day. 2 Chronicles 36, beginning in verse 15, and the Lord God of their fathers sent warnings to them by his messengers. rising up early and sending them, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, till there was no remedy. Therefore he brought against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with the sword of the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young men or virgin, on the aged or the weak. He gave them all into his hand, and all the articles from the house of God, great and small, the treasures of the house of the Lord, and all the treasures of the king and his leaders, all these he took to Babylon. Then they burned the house of God, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious possessions. And those who escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. As long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbaths to fulfill 70 years. So, essentially, that's what Daniel 1 verse 2 alludes to, and that's a little more detail about what's actually happening. So, Jerusalem falls; they're carried away captive about 1,000 miles to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't take everybody, but specifically he wants in his house, in service to him, as sort of a training period of about 3 years, he wants the best and brightest. And apparently some of the best and brightest included Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that we're going to study in Daniel chapter 1. And so let's read our text. Since we've read kind of the background of the book, let's actually go to our text, which is in Daniel chapter 1. Sir, yes. That's right. Thank you, John. Good point. All right, Daniel chapter 1. Let's start in verse 3. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now from among them of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs, and the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies, and as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So he consented with them in this manner and tested them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. So we talked about the background. All right, Daniel has been ripped away from his homeland. He's essentially a hostage in a foreign country. And put yourself in his position. We're taken to a foreign country and a whole new culture, a whole new language. Just a scary situation. He had probably seen friends and family members killed by this very king, Nebuchadnezzar. And so it's probably a very scary time for Daniel. But he has been spared, and he's going to go through this 3-year indoctrination, essentially is what it is, where he's going to be taught the religion of the Chaldeans. He's going to be taught the culture of the Chaldeans. They even change their names. Okay, their names are changed from Hebrew names that alluded to God, and they're given pagan names that allude to deities, or Chaldean names that allude to pagan gods and pagan deities. And so everything that Nebuchadnezzar can do to change these people's, Daniel and his friends, to change who they are as individuals, he's doing that. Okay? From their name to what they study, to their language, to even what they eat. And when I had these lessons when I was a kid, and they would cover Daniel, and this would be one of the lessons that they would teach in Bible class, I think I missed the point, okay? Because I think I remember reading these lessons and thinking that this was about why you should eat vegetables instead of junk food. And could be Mom and Dad taught me that because they wanted me to eat vegetables instead of junk food. I don't know, but that's what I got out of it. So I missed the point. But the point isn't that these boys needed to eat vegetables. The point was whatever was put in front of them was something that was going to make them defiled before God. And we don't know what that was. We can speculate. It could have been some kind of unclean animal. He could have put a plate of pork chops in front of them, for all we know. And that would have made them defiled before God because they weren't supposed to eat unclean animals. And pork was one of those. It could have been something that was okay for them to eat, except for the fact that maybe it had been sacrificed to some god. The Babylonians would often sacrifice an animal in honor to one of their many gods. Maybe this food had been sacrificed to one of the gods of the Chaldeans. Or maybe there was some other reason. Doesn't really matter. Whatever it was going to make Daniel defiled. And so he didn't want to eat it. And really, I think the most important verse, or the verse that jumps out to me, is verse 8. Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies. He purposed in his heart. Do any of your translations say something different than purposed? Some use the word resolved. I think there's some versions that say he resolved or made up his mind. But regardless, he made a decision beforehand, right? He didn't just get there and in the heat of the moment decide to start serving God. Justin let me borrow one of the books from the Freed Hardeman lectures. I know some of you, Derek and others might have, Jackie, you might have been, I don't know, but some went to that, and it was about Daniel, right? And one of the men that gave a lecture was Eric Lyons, and he kind of related this to starting a diet during a church fellowship meal. nobody has ever started a diet during a fellowship meal. That'd be a terrible time to just walk up and see fried chicken and casseroles and all that stuff and say, well, I think I'll start a diet today. Amen, right? So if you're dieting during a fellowship meal, you've probably made a commitment beforehand that that's what you're going to do. You didn't just get there and start and make that decision on the fly. And that's really the way anything that's worth doing and anything that takes any kind of integrity, any kind of effort to be successful at, we have to make a decision to do it. Whether it's to lose weight or to get out of debt or to climb to some position in business, those things don't just happen by accident. And being a faithful Christian doesn't just happen by accident. We have the purpose in our hearts. And we're going to have situations, and we all know this, that we get to where it's going to be too late to decide in the moment how we're going to react. Joseph, when Potiphar's wife came to him, he probably knew beforehand how he was going to react in that situation. In our day today, when we go out with colleagues at work and alcohol is served and other things are going on and gossiping is all around us and any number of other things, it's kind of too late to decide in the moment. It's going to be really hard when we're under the gun and under peer pressure from others to say, I'm not going to partake in those things. But if we've made a decision beforehand, this is what I'm going to do. This is the standard that I live my life by. And here I've got some guiding principles based on the Word of God. It's going to be much easier to make those decisions, and that's what Daniel did. He purposed in his heart beforehand that he wasn't going to defile himself. He made a decision beforehand. Jackie, do you have something? And really, we have to be faithful, and we have to do those things despite what our circumstances are, right? Daniel found himself in some pretty rough circumstances. He had seen people killed. He was away from his home. And by the way, he was probably a teenager when this happened. And so he was in a pretty rough place. And yet he was still faithful to God. If anybody had an excuse to show weakness and to give in to the pressure, give in to the temptation, it was Daniel. He could have reasoned, well, here I am, 1,000 miles away from home. Who's really going to know about it? If I speak up, if I say something, the king's probably going to kill me anyway. I'll just eat this stuff, even though I don't feel good about it. I'm just going to eat it anyway. And we do that, right? We kind of reason and try to rationalize things that are difficult. We really want to do something, so we rationalize a reason why it's okay. God wouldn't be upset if I ate this. It'd be dangerous for me not to. He's okay with me doing this. In our own lives, God's okay with me not doing something I'm supposed to or doing something I'm not supposed to, and we rationalize that away. Jackie? And Edward mentioned Moses, who I can see some similarities between Moses and Daniel. Moses, as a young man, chose. Right? Hebrews said he chose to suffer affliction with the children of God rather than enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. And he made that decision. And Moses was young, just like Daniel is a young man. And it's hard when you're young to make those decisions, but evidently it can be done because they did it. And it would have been easy for Moses to say, well, here I've got a pretty sweet gig here. I can be Pharaoh's daughter's son, and I can live in the palace, and I can have it easy while my Hebrew brethren are out here and they're slaves and they've got it rough, but I can take it easy in the palace and live the good life. That would have been the easy choice. That would have been what a lot of us would have been tempted to do, and yet he chose the difficult way. And the fact of the matter is, and you all know this, that most of the time the easy choice, or a lot of the times anyway, the easy choice isn't the right choice. And to serve God is going to be difficult. And I love the title of our lesson this morning. I think, Doug, that'd make a pretty good sermon. Serving God in Babylon. And don't you think there's a sense in which all of us are serving God in Babylon? We use the term Babylon to describe a wicked place, even today. That's how we use that term. And I don't think our country is maybe as evil as theirs was, but wherever we live in the world, whether it's America or some third world country, we're still in the world. And so there's a sense in which all of us are serving God in a very difficult place that doesn't know God. It's easy to serve God at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning when we're here. That's what people have always said about church camp. That week, it's really easy to serve God. When you're away from the world and you're with other Christian young people, it's easy to be obedient that week. But it's harder when you go out into the world. You've got to make decisions that the world doesn't like, the world doesn't agree with. But before we... Yeah. Sure.
We're serving Him every day. We're fighting for Him every day. And it reminds me of my training in the military. When I was overseas and we would come under attack, I never had to tell you what to do. I did it self-defense because I've been trained for it. You need to, like Jack said, get into the Word of God and study it to the point where something happens. You know what to do.
It's instinct, right? You just do it as second nature. I want to mention something before the second bell. Notice the humble manner that David made this request by. In verse 8, he had purposed in his heart, therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. And then when the chief of the eunuch was worried that he would look worse than the other young men, he came up with this idea to be tested and to have this 10-day trial period of eating vegetables, knowing he knew that God was going to take care of him, but he wasn't belligerent about it. He wasn't lecturing the Babylonians on why they shouldn't eat meat. He just was humble about it and very tactful. And sometimes we aren't that way. Sometimes we want to smack somebody over the head with the Bible rather than just letting them see Christ in us. And I noticed that about Daniel, that he didn't smack him over the head with Leviticus 11 and say, here's why you shouldn't be eating this stuff. Instead, he just kind of won them over with his character.
He knew what to do.
Sure. And he knew that God was going to be watching over him too. Appreciate your comments. Appreciate each of you being here this morning. Thank you.